inferior function, friend or foe. And the reason I've came up with this idea is because we often talk about the inferior function in not so great terms. So it's to show that there are two sides to everything, or different shades. So a bit like you often hear me talking about personality in terms of different levels of development and different ways that our personality can show up. And for me, it's the same with the inferior function, that it has various guises and various levels of efficacy for us. So the plan is, I just need to move this block of pictures of people. The plan is to first of all look at the nature of the inferior function, and then talk about how it emerges and manifests and energizes itself. Then I was going to look through a couple of the negative expressions, so that the grip, which many of you will be familiar with, and then the idea of how we can use it for projection, which isn't always so great, and then move into the positive influences that it can have. And these are a bit less talked about. So how we can use it for balance and restoration. And then the importance of nurturing and looking after our dear inferior function as well. There will be a breakout room. I think it's after the negative expressions, of course, to let you all like vent. And then we will look at the positives, talk about nurturing, and then there'll be some time at the end for Q&A. So that's the plan. So first of all, just a quick exercise to set us up for what we're going to do as we go. Can you write down 3 words to describe yourself? And if you can't think of them, just have the piece of paper next to you, and hopefully it will come up as we're going through the session. And then probably even easier, 3 words that you are definitely not. So things that you are definitely not like. Okay, so if you can do that and keep that little list handy, or create it as we go through the session, that would be really good, because we'll be using that information later. I'm trying to practice speaking slower today, having seen how quickly I tend to speak in presentations. So first of all, the nature of the inferior function. This is where I do need my glasses, because that's smaller than I thought. So sorry about the glasses glare. It's opposite to our dominant function. You know all this already. So it's opposite in every way. So if we're predominantly introverted, it will be extroverted. If we're predominantly extroverted, it will be introverted. And I've written there, it's our ego identity, because in a way, our dominant function is who we think we are. So you might look at those 3 words you've written to describe yourself and already say, actually, that's pretty much describing my dominant function. So if somebody asked me as a dominant introverted intuitive, I would be saying I'm curious and exploratory and experimental and all those sorts of things that the introverted intuitives do. So it's opposite to our dominant function in terms of introversion, extroversion, and it's the other end of the dichotomy pole. So it would be sensing or intuition, vice versa, thinking or feeling, vice versa. You knew all that anyway. So it's the part of us that we've rejected that doesn't fit with our ego image. So possibly the list of I am not would be describing your inferior function. So what happens as we grow and develop is we start to develop a sense of who we are. This is the differentiation stage of Jung's theory. So we start off as a sort of a whole innocent little baby, and as we grow up, even though we're pre-wired according to type theory, we start to say, this is me and this is not me, this is what I like, this is what I don't like. And the things that we reject start to go into the shadow to some extent, but I'm going to make a case for the fact that it's not all in the shadow. Oops, I'm clicking the wrong thing. And interestingly, it lives between the conscious and unconscious. So we often talk about it as being an unconscious function, living in the unconscious. But those of you who are familiar with the BB model will see that he has it on his conscious axis as well, that it is part of our consciousness. And I think it's sort of a bit of both. And I'm going to show, hopefully in a minute, a quote from Jung where he's suggesting a similar idea. But before I get to that quote, just to state that it's a bit undifferentiated, the inferior function. It's messy. It's influenced by our other less preferred functions as well, and the contents of our shadow. And that will be more obvious as we start to go through as well. That we can mix it up with, so for my example, I could mix it up with my feeling preferences and things like that. It could all come out in that way. And really, it just wants to be accepted. So hopefully that's where we'll end up at the end of this. So talking about it being conscious or unconscious, this is a quote from Jung's psychological type, who says, in normal cases, the inferior function remains conscious, at least in its effects, which means it is always a part of us. It's always there somewhere. It affects how we think. So even though we haven't chosen it in our type preferences, it's always there. And then he goes on to say, in neurosis, it sinks wholly or partly into the unconscious. So this is when it plays out in ways that we're not choosing or we're not necessarily aware of, and in ways that are usually a little bit grubby, not so well developed, a little bit immature. So for Jung, it's conscious usually, which would coincide with Beebe's model, but when it's in neurosis, when it's not being used well, when we're not in control of it, that's when it can be more of an unconscious thing. So hopefully that will become clear. So where does this thing live? So this is my map of the psyche, sort of very similar to most maps of the psyche you see in Jungian writing. And you've got here your outward bit there is your persona. So this is the image you show the world, and that will vary. You vary your persona depending on what situation you're in. And that's a healthy thing to do. It's not, I know it's sometimes called a mask, and it can be a mask, but quite often it's a sign of good adaptation to different situations and good use of emotional intelligence. And within that, you've got your ego, which is part of who you think you are, your identity. Now, in the core, you've got this idea of the true self, which I'm sure many of you have come across before, which is the real you that maybe is a bit more whole, maybe isn't so mask wearing. It's a bit of a weird thing to say in the pandemic. Maybe a little bit less identified with who you are, and possibly contains some of those parts of you that you've rejected. So you can see the self starts to dip into the shadow as well. Some of our self is in shadow, and that would be things like, our untapped potential, things we never knew we were capable of, or sides of us we haven't really visited. So that's why the shadow contains lots of things that aren't so great. So repressed memories, things we don't like, strange experiences or reactions we have. But it also contains some positive, some untapped potential. And this is all in I'm not going to go into the collective unconscious and stuff. That's a different subject. So for me, the inferior function is lurking somewhere around there. It's part of our true self, part of it's in shadow, part of it is in consciousness and our ego. So it's in consciousness because we know what we don't like. So that's why we're aware of it. But I have got it overlapping into that outer bubble a bit, because even though I said I wasn't going into the collective unconscious, I forgot that I am going to go into the collective unconscious, that we can, it can be affected by our images of archetypes that we carry, or our experiences of cultures and things like that. So that can affect how we see our inferior function. So that's where I personally, I made this up, it's not from a book, place it in the map of the psyche. Okay, this is a quote from Daryl Sharp. So he's saying the shadow is potentially both creative and destructive. Creative in that it represents aspects of oneself that have been buried or that might yet be realized. So that's the untapped potential part, the light shadow, the parts of self that we don't know we can do yet. And then destructive in the sense that its value system and motivations tend to undermine or disturb one's conscious image of ourselves. So it can be a disturbance to who we think we are as well, especially when it does like crop up on us uninvited. which I think might be the next bit. So, as we all know, the psyche is dynamic. It's moving about. It's energetic. It's all about energy in the Jungian model, and it attempts to regulate its way in similar. This is typical INTJ-ness. Similar to the laws of thermodynamics in physics. Richard will get this as well. So there's this idea in your psyche that there's this fight for equivalence. So you've got your functions in there, all 8, bobbing around. Usually your preferences are getting the most energy and they're up the top, and the others are submerged somewhat. But there is a general struggle that they all want to have some sort of equal balance. They never will be, but that's what's going on. So that's why sometimes when we feel pressured, we throw more into our preferences, our ego side, to try and, like, you know, we push that part forward, but all the time we're pushing the other part back. And that's why good development actually is you're never going to be balanced, but to be as in balance as you can be is the good development. And the other bit of the thermodynamics is this idea of entropy. And this is that for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction type of idea. So the more we're pushing into our preferences, we're charging up our non-preferences, but in a negative way. And so there's a quote here, hold on a minute, keep having to move these pictures of people and me. There's a little quote here from Jung again, that says, when a function that usually should normally be conscious lapses into the unconscious, its specific energy passes into the unconscious too. So what he's saying there is that the energy doesn't go away from it, it takes its energy with it. But this is also the same for if we're pushing too much energy into our preferences, we're charging up the others, which I think is the next one. Here we go, yes. So again from Daryl Sharp, here the shadow and persona function in a corresponding way. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow. So it's almost like the more you're pushing into your ego, your preferences, the more you're charging up that shadow side of yourself. I'm going to pause just for a second there before I go into the I think it's the applications next, yeah, just to see if there are any questions or comments from there. Richard's been...
Yeah, if you want to put anything in the chat, what was a comment? It says one who rejects their inferior function, maybe to do maybe shadow boxing. One who embraces their inferior function, maybe shadow dancing.
Oh, that's really lovely. That's a lovely way of putting it. And in a way, that's the vibe of the presentation that you've just captured there, I think. So are there any other quick questions before we move on? Who is Daryl Sharp? Book reference. Oh yeah, I'm very bad for that. I've got a few of his books actually. He tends to write about Jung. So I've got, let's see them on the shelf. He's got one literally about personality types that he puts in his own words, and another one called A Jungian Psychology Unplugged. So they're the two that I've got. I don't know if anyone else has got any others. They might want to put them in the chat. But he tends to write about Jung in a way that I understand more than I can follow Jung's actual books. So there you go. Right, let's see what comes next then. So you will all be familiar with this idea of the stress reaction. So this is one of the negative expressions of the inferior function. So the stress reaction has 2 stages. Quite often everyone goes rushing towards the stage 2, but the stage 1 is much more interesting for me and much more common. So the stage 1 of the stress response is that you start to exaggerate your dominant function. So your dominant function, you're under pressure. You think, oh, I've got to, so if you're me, I've got to write a presentation. It must be, theoretical. Not everyone likes that. It's, I'll try and do something a little bit creative with it, la da 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 da. So I'll start to push my own ego image of being this great introverted intuitive presenter, and start to, if I'm feeling pressured and it's not happening, it'll start to get really, really tunnel vision and restricted and actually not very effective. And all the time I'm pushing away my auxiliary function, my thinking, which is saying, remember what the point of this is. It's not all about you. What's the point? What's the objective? What should you be doing? What would be a good outcome? Yeah, I almost have to write that down in front of myself sometimes, because I'd be so focused on the introverted intuition. So you might take a moment to think about your own dominant function and how does that look when you're under pressure? Is that what you really kick into to rely on? And this is where most people actually spend a lot of time, especially at the moment where we're all constantly under pressure. A lot of people are in this state, or this is how they experience stress. So it's not really to be underplayed. And a good way, the tip for getting out of that state is actually to engage your dominant function. So I phone up Anna, who I think is on this thing, and I went, Anna, I need to talk this out because my head is all tangled up. And that's how I fix it. And likewise, people with extroverted functions might say, right, stop kicking in with the action, sit quietly, talk to one person, do some writing, get your head back together. So eventually you've pushed so much energy into this dominant function that it has to be carried off in a stretcher by your other functions. So you literally exhaust it and burn it out. So this can also be seen probably more commonly in stress, real illness, when people are sort of feeling really, really ill, very run down, very exhausted, or when they're super duper drunk. Which is one of my hobbies, watching this kick off in the pub. So you'll see this same reaction that it all gets very exaggerated and then suddenly, whoosh, it gets burned out. So again, Darryl Sharp, the extent a person functions too one-sidedly, the inferior function behaves correspondingly primitive and troublesome. So that's that idea that you're all the time, you're pushing that energy into the dominant function, you're pulling it, you're charging up your inferior function in a more negative way. So yes, you've been carried off in a stretcher by your other functions, and this is where we get the grip, which is the term coined by Naomi Quenk, who did a lot of work on this. So she's got the books In the Grip and Was That Really Me? Because the idea of the grip is it's an inferior function hijack. It's seen you get carried off in the stretcher and it takes its moment to pounce. So I quite liken it. I often use the analogy of a beach ball, that if you push down on a beach ball and you bob it nicely under your foot, you can feel it wanting to push back, but it's all under control. Then you push a bit harder and you can feel the energy pushing even further against your foot. And then one day you give it a great big stamp and it sort of comes up, hits you in the face, and goes flying off into the sea, and you've lost it. So it's that idea of that energy, when it's just being put into the preferences a little bit, it's fine, things are quite in balance. But when you're really forcing it, you're charging up the energy to take over, so that equivalence. And then lo and behold, look, that naughty little red inferior function has run off with your ball and taken the show. So that's the one we're most familiar with. And the expression of the inferior function in this stage, as you know, is not pretty. It's primitive. It's not under your conscious control. And one of the reasons Naomi Quenk's book was called Was That Really Me? Was because that's what people often say after they've had a grip experience, was like, oh, was that really me? It felt like someone was pulling the strings, or it felt like I was watching myself from the sky, or I don't know what came over me. It's a real departure from yourself. So all the things on the "this is not me" list, add a little bit of primitive caveman to it, and you've got your grip experience. So it's not pretty. But the reason it happens is actually restorative. It's supposed to stop you burning out. So it's almost, if you use the car analogy, it's a bit like saying, you're driving too fast, you're pushing yourself too much, you're getting exhausted, let someone else take the wheel for a while. Sadly, it's the baby in the back of the car who takes the wheel. So it's not so great, but that's how it is, a restorative process. So here's another quote from the mysterious Darryl Sharp. So the essence of the inferior function is autonomy. It's independent, it attacks, it fascinates and spins us about, so we're no longer masters of ourselves and can no longer rightly distinguish between ourselves and others. So no longer masters of ourselves is where it sort of takes over what we're doing. So very, very messy, and no longer distinguish between ourselves and others. We can get very defensive and very messy and blamey, and everything's everybody else's fault when we're in the grip of our inferior function. Are there any questions about grip and stress? Oh, thank you, Katie Jones. You like my beach ball comparison. That's good. Okay, so I promised I'd take pauses in this, and there's one of them. So projection, this is the other way we use our inferior function, not so greatly. And this is, you're probably familiar with this as well. Hang on, keep going to move these pictures. This is where we unconsciously attribute our negative characteristics to someone else. So I don't know if you've ever been sort of on a walk with your friend and they say, oh, Sally drives me nuts. She's always interrupting. She's always got something to say. Every time you're talking, she says, yeah, and about me. And you're sitting there thinking, well, you do exactly the same thing. Are you not aware of you doing that as well? So it's that idea that sometimes that the things that really, really annoy us, but almost disproportionately annoy us about other people, are often things about ourselves that we're either denying or unaware of, or even maybe a bit envious of sometimes, that you know, it lives maybe in our light shadow, that we can't access it, but where we get annoyed when someone else does it because somewhere in our unconscious we're aware that it's what we're not good at. So it's attributing characteristics to someone else. It's a really common thing. We all do it. It's an ego defense mechanism. It's a part of life. But the most dangerous psychological mistake, says Jung, is the projection of the shadow onto others. It's the root of almost all conflicts. So it really is. I mean, God, don't want to get political, but, you know, let's just say on a global scale, we project those bad people over there when we do bad things over here too. So that's enough said about that. You can sit and think about that at leisure while you watch the happy news. Okay, so again, Daryl Sharp's personality types: oversensitivity and strong emotional reactions of any kind, from falling in love, which is a projection, to blind rage, a sure sign that the inferior function, along with one or more complexes, has been activated. So the one or more complexes were those other messy bits from the shadow and the unconscious, and maybe the collective unconscious. So it's usually an inferior function and a bit of mess and some collective unconscious and an archetype all messed together. But it's that first part. It's when you really have that strong emotional reaction. It's not just something's a little bit annoying, because, you know, most of us are a little bit annoying, but it's when something really makes your blood boil or pushes your buttons. And I often use the example of, this is quite a few years old now, but it just sticks in my mind, of Ellen MacArthur, who was a lady who went around the world in, see, I can't even talk about it in any exciting way. Went around the world in a boat, I was going to say. She sailed around the world in a yacht or something. Anyway, it was very brave of her, really dangerous thing to do, and all this stuff. Now, you've got to remember, my inferior function is extroverted sensing. So I'd been in the house for a long time trying to work on something nerdy. So my introverted intuition was on fire. And on the radio, Ellen MacArthur had finished her voyage and was coming into Southampton, and they were interviewing people on the radio who were waving flags and saying things like, oh, she makes me proud to be British. And I'm like, well, what's it got to do with you? You didn't do anything. And then it was like, oh, she should be made a dame and all this. I'm like, well, for rowing around in a boat, you know. And I was like, I really like went for it. I was on my own, but I was having a little rant. You know, you don't learn anything from doing that. We know what's out there. It's dangerous, blah, blah. What's the point? Really not very nice stuff coming out of me. And it really was my inferior function kicking off of, and if I really sat and thought about it, there is no way on earth I'd ever be brave enough to do something like that. That just the very idea of it scared me to death. But all this projection stuff was coming out onto this poor woman who I have no ill feeling for, but at that time was just getting really irritated. And I caught myself because I thought, I'm having this massive rant and shouting fit in my kitchen here. Why? So it's that sort of thing. Anyway, that's my story. So I hope you get what I mean by that. So the thing to do is to own your projections, as I eventually did in the kitchen, realizing that there's nothing wrong with what she's done. And in fact, it's very impressive. And it's me projecting my stuff onto her. So what I want you to do is think about someone that really irritates or annoys you. You do not have to name names. It could be me as well. So that's all right. Think of someone that irritates or annoys you. You don't have to say who they are. And think about what is it about them, the specific thing. And you'll probably find as you start to talk about it, you start to rage up a bit. And then have a look at the words you've written on your bit of paper at the beginning to describe you and not you, and think, oh, actually, am I seeing this playing out here? And then try and turn it around to own your projections. So think about what are the positives of this person's behavior. So like I said, this Ellen MacArthur person, really brave, really inspiring to loads of people, really skilled at what she does, you know, all this stuff that I would never be able to do. Is that something you're lacking in your personality or life? So what I'm going to do is ask you to go into breakout rooms, and this is all in the spirit of learning, and learning about how to own your projections. So it's not I know it might be quite uncomfortable for some people to actually do this, and as I said, don't name names if you don't want to, unless it's Nigel Farage, go for him. But think of someone who really irritates or annoys you, and then maybe think of these questions and discuss with your group. So you're going to be in groups of 4, and I'm going to give you 15 minutes, because when I did this ROSAP, I gave 10, and everybody said once they got into it, they wanted more time. If you find you don't need more time, just chat amongst yourselves until it's finished. But we're going to give you 15 minutes. Okay. Does everyone know what to do? Richard, do I have to stop? Great. So there's not really any time for a debrief on that, but I hope you had some fruitful conversations and got some insights into your own selves. So I'm going to move on to now the positive aspects of the inferior function in the last couple of minutes. So here's a quote, I think it's from Young actually. Oh, hang on, just went backwards the wrong way. Where's previous gone? Previous. To extricate the inferior function from the unconscious fantasy formations that have now been activated must be brought to the surface. So this is all about bringing things up to awareness, and which is hopefully what you've just done in that last exercise, is start to bring something up to awareness, or you may have already been aware of it. The conscious realization of these fantasies brings the inferior function to consciousness and then makes further development possible. So only by raising it up to awareness can you start to actually work with it, and it can be a fantastic learning experience. So acceptance and integration of your inferior function. Do this by owning your projections, as we just practiced in that exercise there. Recognize when something's activating you and take the time to consider what that means about you or what it's trying to tell you. Take some time to identify your less desirable characteristics. So really be honest with yourself about what things you might do, or ask people that you trust to give you feedback. And just accept that you and everyone else, we all have flaws because we're human, but don't go all Darth Vader about it though. So that doesn't, sometimes, I don't know if you remember when you very first learned about type, sometimes it can make you play up to type a bit more. And likewise, sometimes when you learn about your shadow side, you can play up to that a little bit more as well. So that's what I mean by don't go all Darth Vader about it. So don't start to over-identify with it. And very much, it's being said here, the ideal is to have an ego strong enough to acknowledge both the persona and the shadow without identifying with either. So really not getting trapped in the I'm this and I'm not this, or I'm all, this is how I want to be portrayed and these are the things I don't want, or going all Darth Vader. So conscious and all right, so this relaxation and restoration, I've been playing with this idea for a while, and there's lots of spiritual texts written about the inferior function being the gateway to spirituality and things, which I don't know so much about. But certainly for relaxation and restoration, if you use your inferior function consciously and deliberately, it can actually be very restorative and quite a lot of fun. But the key thing is it has to be a choice. So when you're forced into an activity that's to do with your inferior function, it's likely to stress you out. But if you consciously engage with it, and sometimes it takes a bit of bravery and open-mindedness, I'm not going to go and sail a boat around the world, but things like, for me, it's as simple as go for a walk with no purpose and end up where you started from, can actually be quite enjoyable. Or do something that frightens you a little bit would be one of mine as well. Shouldn't go on too long, ideally, and it needs to happen in the place or with people that you're comfortable with. And you'll find that you often have the best fun. So I often tell this story about how we had to go to a laser, running around in the dark with lasers shooting each other event once, and I really didn't want to go because I thought it was silly and pointless. And then when we got there, it was the most fun. I really enjoyed myself and felt really good for ages. So unleashing that inferior function. And this is something, the question at the bottom, something I've just been toying with. I have this idea that we unconsciously access our inferior function, but not necessarily in the opposite orientation when we're trying to relax. So to give you an example, at the end of, and this could be because I'm a J and I draw the line under the day, because I found that J's sort of get with this and P's maybe not always so much. But when I sort of have my end of day point where I say, Angelina has left the building, I'm not doing any more work, I'm not doing any more of this and that, I tend to sort of get, glass of wine, packet of crisps, I just want to watch nonsense on the telly, little short things that make me laugh, and I don't require too much of, working out or things like that. And that's how I relax. And I find that really restorative. But what's interesting is I do it on my own. So it's sort of extroverted sensing, but without other people. And I've asked quite a few people this question about what they do to relax. And it seems to be a similar pattern that you use your inferior function, but not so much on the extroverted or introverted opposite to whatever you are side. So if anybody has thoughts on that and wants to drop me an email with what they do, continue the research, that would be great. And this is a really important thing. Our inferior function is a little bit like an animal that lives in a cage. So it's there, it's got all this energy charged in it, and the more you neglect it, as we talked about earlier, the more it's going to be energized to take charge. So rejecting it makes it more hostile, if you think of it in animal terms, and denial of its existence will make it want to be exposed. So the more you deny things, as they say, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. So basically, the thing is to feed the poor sod and take it out for a walk once in a while. So try and find those activities where you can willingly and comfortably engage with your inferior function, or even own those projections, have those conversations in coaching or with your friends about, things that maybe don't always fit with your ego image. Okay, and look, then he's friends with all your other functions, skipping along. So we've got a couple of minutes left if there are any final questions or reflections or discussion points. And I'm also going to put a little link in the chat of, I'm just trying out a few type questions as well. So if anybody is willing to have a little go, I'll put the link in the chat. But otherwise, that's me. I'll turn off the sharing. How do I get your email? I'll put it here. That's that. So reading romance novels for but for extroverted feeling. Catherine, that's lovely actually, because again, reading's a solitary thing, but it's getting to that feeling side. That's nice. Working on spreadsheets. Oh, Christine, that's sad. Yeah, I guess thinking types do love a spreadsheet. Think of a way of putting your research together. Give me a shout. Thank you, John. That's great. Playing good word games with my INTP husband. That's interesting, actually, Marky. My sister's an extroverted feeling type, and when we go on holiday, she plays like Sudoku and logic puzzles and things like that, which I would never really think was her sort of thing. There's quite a few things coming out here, so that would be nice. I'll try and keep the chat there. Okay, are there any questions? You can feel free to come off mute. We've just got a couple of minutes left.
Put it in the chat. There's one more.
Tai Chi video versus Tai Chi class. Yeah. Ideas on problem as well. Yeah. So does that theory seem to fit with people, that we actually do automatically use our inferior functions without knowing we're doing it, because maybe it's not putting such a strain on our natural extroversion, introversion? Like I said, there's more research needs to be done, but it's an interesting idea, because it's almost counterintuitive, isn't it, that you would go there against your preferences, but in the right sort of setting. INTJ do the same as you, but I believe this is SC but primitive use. Paul, there is a bit too much wine, a bit too many crisps involved in my relaxation, I will admit that. If that's what you're getting at. Yeah, it's trying to, yeah, you engage with your inferior function. That's what I mean about gains Darth Vader. You just go a little bit too far because it's such fun. And I have to say, I think having extroverted sensing as an inferior, although it can be quite scary at times, can also be quite fun, without saying too much. What would be suitable for inferior S? Oh, that introverted sensing. Carl, I've heard a lot of interest. ENFP types say they might enjoy looking through photo albums and things like that, or reminiscing with friends on past experiences and things like that. I don't know if that fits with you. Yeah.
It fits, actually. I was thinking about inner sensations, bodily sensations and such. Mm-hmm. So therefore I thought that what might be suitable regarding that, because that's also kind of, you know, I might be overly sensitive to inner bodily sensations and so forth.
That happens. That can happen as a grip response, as hypochondria type of thing, if that's ever happened to you. But I guess as well, you can sort of really tune into physical things, like if you're doing exercise or stuff. Like another one of my extroverted sensing activities is
what I do, a lot of exercise. So and I find it's very, and that's kind of an extroverted activity, but still it's, for me, it's kind of an inner satisfaction to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can